In addition to the null conditional operator, you also have the help of the null coalescing operator, null coalescing assignment, and the null forgiving operator. In combination with the null conditional operator, we may want to introduce a default value if one couldn't be retrieved. Let's experiment with this. The order that we've defined using a record uses a few default parameters. Setting a reference type to the default value means that this will be null. This produces a warning because we've defined that this is a non-nullable property. Change the shipping provider to a nullable shipping provider. Going back to the event handler that handles when the order is created, we may now want to use the shipping provider. This will give you a nullable shipping provider. If you explicitly declare that this is a non-nullable shipping provider, we'll get a warning. As you know by now, this is because the left-hand side of the assignment defines a non-nullable reference type, and it's assigned a nullable reference type. In this scenario, we'd like to create an instance or use an already existing instance of the default shipping provider. We can do this by introducing the null coalescing operator. Using the double question marks, we can say that if the left-hand side of this operator is null, we'll use the right-hand side of this operator. Simply put, if the shipping provider on the order that has been passed to this event handler is null, we'll create a new instance. Another way to achieve the same thing is to use the null coalescing assignment. On the left-hand side, we use the variable that we want to ensure has a proper instance. Then the null coalescing assignment is written using double question marks, followed by the equal sign. On the right-hand side of this assignment is what will be assigned to the left-hand side if the variable is null. This is just an alternative way of saying that we want to assign the provider to a new instance if the provider is null. Notice that the compiler is smart about this. If we access something from the provider, such as the name, it won't give us any warnings, because it knows that we've used the null coalescing assignment above. If we comment that part out, the compiler generates a warning. Again, we made sure that we found and worked around a potential null reference exception. The compiler will not always be able to figure out if you've done the appropriate null checks yourself and already have guarded against null. Let's create a class inside the business layer that validates the shipping provider before it's allowed to be used for an order. We can introduce a method inside this class that helps with validation based on a set of criteria. Maybe that method already performs a null check. Will the compiler be able to understand this? Let's create a static method that returns a Boolean, and we'll call this validate shipping provider. This accepts a nullable shipping provider. Inside this method, we'll use pattern matching to ensure that we have an instance as well as the freight cost being above 100. If this is the case, we are going to return true. Otherwise, we'll return false. If we use this method inside the event handler to validate the shipping provider before accessing its properties, we know that this has performed a null check. But the compiler doesn't. I'd argue that this makes sense. Is there a way to indicate to the compiler that we know better and that this has already been taken care of? there's an operator called the null forgiving operator. The null forgiving operator is written using an exclamation mark. This lets you indicate to the compiler that what it warns about potentially being null has already been checked. You guarantee that this is not null. You know what's going to happen if it's null? It'll throw an exception. This does not only make it harder to find the potential null reference exceptions, as the warnings now went away, but you've also opened up for the possibility of this actually throwing a null reference exception. Maybe this next example will convince you that this is definitely not a good idea. If we explicitly declare that a type is non-nullable, setting this to null yields a warning. However, we can promise the compiler that null isn't null, and therefore we'd get rid of the warning. It's just that. It's a way to get rid of the warning. Most of the time, you definitely do not know better than the compiler. In our case with the method validate shipping provider, we definitely did know that this performed a null check. Isn't there a better alternative than using the null forgiving operator? There certainly is. With the help of the attributes for null state static analysis, we can apply attributes to indicate to the compiler what to do in this particular scenario. Of course, the best approach would have been to get rid of the nullable reference types. In a perfect world, we could have introduced an architecture that worked with instances that correspond with a default value, instead of relying on null. This way, we can avoid null reference exceptions. We'll take a look at the attributes for null state static analysis next, and see how we can change the method validate shipping provider to indicate to the compiler that it already performed a null check.